The dark truth about the Wild West was nothing like the version Hollywood sold to us in movies like The Good, The Bad, and The Ugly and Tombstone. The Wild West wasn't endless gunfights, fearless gunslingers, dramatic duels at high noon, or lawless towns ruled by outlaws. The real West was slower, harsher, dirtier, more regulated, and far more complex than the romantic legend burned into our imagination. The Wild West wasn't what Hollywood told you. For over a century, cinema has shaped how we see the American frontier. We imagine a dusty street under a burning sun. A saloon door swings open. Boots step onto wooden planks. A mysterious stranger adjusts his revolver. The town freezes. A sheriff narrows his eyes. Wind pushes tumbleweeds between them. Silence. A twitch of a finger. A single shot echoes. But that sin, as powerful as it is mostly fiction. The real frontier was not a constant battlefield. It was a place of economic ambition, survival, exhaustion, migration, and adaptation. It was a massive social experiment unfolding in real time. Railroads were expanding. Telegraph wires were stretching across landscapes. Immigrants were arriving. Former soldiers were trying to rebuild their lives after the Civil War. Families were searching for land. Entrepreneurs were chasing opportunity. And contrary to popular belief, many frontier towns were actively trying to avoid chaos. One of the biggest myths about the Old West is that everyone carried a gun everywhere at all times. The image is so deeply embedded in pop culture that it feels unquestionable. But historical records tell a different story. Many towns, including well-known frontier settlements, had strict ordinances prohibiting the carrying of firearms within city limits. Visitors were often required to surrender their weapons upon entering town. Signs were posted. Sheriffs enforced the rules. Business owners supported them. Why would a lawless town ban guns? Because towns wanted to grow. Merchants didn't want customers afraid to walk the streets. Investors didn't want reputations of chaos. Familias didn't want random violence. Stability meant economic survival. A town known for constant shootouts would struggle to attract settlers, rail connections, and commerce. The West was not trying to stay wild. It was trying to become civilized. Gunfights, the symbolic heartbeat of Western mythology, were surprisingly rare events. When violence did occur, it was usually tied to very specific disputes. Land claims, cattle theft, political arguments, or deeply personal grudges. It was not daily entertainment. It was not choreographed. It was not theatrical. Take the infamous shootout at the OK Corral. In movies, it feels like a prolonged cinematic climax. In reality, it lasted roughly 30 seconds. 30 seconds of confusion, smoke, noise, and chaos. Not a dramatic, minute-long standoff in perfect symmetry. Not two men calmly calculating their draw speed. Real violence was fast, unpredictable, and often unfair. The average day in a frontier town was far less dramatic. People worked, they traded goods. They repaired equipment, they negotiated deals. They argued over prices. They worried about crops. They worried about drought. They worried about disease. Which brings us to something Hollywood rarely shows. The West was physically brutal. Dust was constant. Streets were unpaved. Waste management was primitive. Water quality varied wildly. Sanitation systems were basic or non-existent. In many tones, livestock shared space with people. Mud mixed with manure. Flies were everywhere. This was not a glamorous environment. It was survival under pressure. And then there's the cowboy. The ultimate Western icon. The image of the lone gunslinger riding into the sunset has become almost mythological. But the average cowboy was not a duelist. He was a laborer, a cattle worker, often young, sometimes just a teenager. He earned modest wages. He slept outdoors for months during cattle drives. He endured heat, storms, river crossings, and exhaustion. Many cowboys were African American. Many were Mexican vaqueros, whose cattle handling traditions heavily influenced what we now call cowboy culture. The Hollywood image of a solitary white hero oversimplifies a far more diverse and interconnected reality. Cowboy life was repetitive, grueling, dangerous in quiet ways. A fall from a horse could cripple you. A snakebite miles from help could end your life. A simple infection could escalate into something fatal. And yet, the myth grew. Why? Because newspapers in frontier towns were competing for readership. Sensationalism sold copies. A minor dispute could be reframed as a legendary confrontation. An outlaw could be transformed into a notorious villain. A lawman could become a near-mythical guardian of justice. Exaggeration became entertainment. Entertainment became memory. Memory became a history. By the time early filmmakers began creating Western films, the legend was already inflated. Cinema didn't invent the myth. It amplified it. Black and white reels cemented dramatic narratives into cultural identity. The West became symbolic. Rugged individualism, moral conflict, survival against odds. But the real West was more bureaucratic than dramatic, more exhausting than glamorous, more regulated than anarchic. It was a place of paperwork, land disputes, railroad schedules, supply shortages, and long stretches of monotony broken occasionally by flashes of conflict. And that complexity is far more fascinating than the myth, because when we strip away the romantic filter, we see something human. We see communities trying to establish order in unstable conditions. We see migrants chasing opportunity. We see workers enduring physical strain for modest pay. We see towns struggling to balance freedom with safety. The Wild West was not a non-stop action scene. It was a developing society under pressure, and that pressure shaped everything. If you've made it this far, you're already seeing the cracks in the Hollywood version. But we're just getting started. Because next, we're going deeper into the daily reality of frontier life. The economics, the boredom, the fear, and the truth about how rare violence actually was. Before we continue, comment below. Did you grow up believing the Hollywood version of the Wild West? And if you want more deep dives that uncover the truth behind legendary eras of history, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. Because the deeper we go, the darker and more surprising it gets. The daily reality of the Wild West was dominated not by duels in dusty streets, but by labor, economics, exhaustion, and long stretches of monotony. If you strip away the cinematic drama, what you find is a society obsessed, not with violence, but with survival and growth. The average cowboy did not wake up preparing for a showdown. He woke up sore. He woke up tired. He woke up knowing he had miles of cattle to move under a brutal sun. Most cowboys earn between $25 and $40 a month. That might not sound terrible at first glance, but consider the conditions. They worked from before sunrise until after sunset. They slept outdoors. They dealt with extreme weather, freezing nights, scorching days, violent thunderstorms that could trigger deadly stampedes. A cattle drive could last 2 to 3 months. 2 to 3 months of dust in your lungs, sweat in your clothes, limited bathing, constant If cattle panicked in the middle of the night, hundreds could bolt at once. Cowboys would have to ride into the chaos, risking being trampled. There was no workers' compensation, no health insurance, no safety net. If you were injured badly, you might be hundreds of miles from a doctor. And even if you reached one, medical care was primitive compared to modern standards. This was the real wildness of the West, unpredictability of environment, not constant gunfire. Frontier towns themselves were economic experiments. Many were built rapidly around railroads, mining opportunities, or cattle routes. Boomtowns could explode in population almost overnight. Thousands might arrive chasing gold, silver, land, or trade opportunities. But boomtowns were unstable. When a mine dried up or a railroad shifted routes, populations could collapse just as quickly. Entire towns were abandoned. Buildings left behind. Dreams evaporated. Hollywood rarely shows the economic anxiety, the fear of failure, the uncertainty of tomorrow. In movies, the West feels permanent. Iconic wooden buildings standing heroically against the horizon. In reality, many frontier settlements were temporary, improvised, built quickly with limited materials. And here's something that challenges the myth even further. Some historians estimate that certain frontier towns had lower homicide rates than modern American cities today. Yes, violence existed. Yes, there were outlaws, but statistically, constant daily shootouts were not the norm. Think about it logically. If gunfights were happening every day in the middle of town, businesses would fail. Families would leave. Investors would avoid the area. Growth would stop. But many frontier towns grew successfully. They attracted merchants, families, teachers, and clergy. Law enforcement existed. Courts existed. Jails existed. Were they perfect? No. Were they corrupt sometimes? Absolutely. But the idea of a completely lawless wasteland is exaggerated. Quick-draw duels, the cinematic staple, were particularly rare. Most real gunfights did not happen face-to-face in open streets. They happened suddenly. At close range, often fueled by alcohol or personal disputes. Sometimes inside buildings where chaos replaced choreography. There was no dramatic pause, no dramatic music, no symmetrical standoff. Real violence is rarely elegant. And then there's the saloon, the cultural symbol of frontier life. Hollywood portrays saloons as constant hubs of brawls, gambling, whiskey shots, and piano music. And yes, those elements existed. But saloons were also networking centers. Political discussions happened there. Business negotiations happened there. Community information spread there. It was the social media platform of its time. Deals over cattle. Discussions about railroad expansion. Debates over land rights. It wasn't non-stop bar fights. And gambling, often portrayed as chaotic and lawless, was frequently regulated. Towns imposed restrictions, some even banned it temporarily to attract families and investors. The West was constantly balancing two forces: freedom and order, expansion and stability, opportunity and risk. And beneath it all was diversity. The Hollywood narrative often centers on a narrow image of the frontier hero, but many cowboys were African American. Historians estimate as many as 1 in 4. Mexican vaqueros shaped cattle techniques, clothing styles, and horsemanship traditions. Long before the American cowboy became iconic, Native American tribes were not background characters in someone else's story. They were nations defending land, culture, and survival against rapid expansion. Their displacement and suffering are central to understanding the real West. The myth simplifies everything into heroes and villains. Reality is layered, complex, often uncomfortable, and far more interesting, because when you see the West clearly, you realize it was not a non-stop war zone. It was a society in transition, a massive, chaotic, ambitious transition. And transitions are messy, but not always cinematic. If you're still watching, you're already seeing how different the truth is from the legend. But we're about to go deeper, because the next layer strips away one of the most romanticized illusions of all: hygiene, disease, and the medical nightmares of frontier life. Before we move on, take a second to hit the like button. It helps this video reach more people who love uncovering hidden history. And comment below, what surprised you most so far? The gun laws? The low frequency of duels? Or the economic struggle? Stay with me, because the deeper we go, the darker it gets. If you want to understand the dark truth about the Wild West, look beyond gunfights and outlaws into something far more disturbing. Daily life itself was dangerous, not because someone might challenge you at high noon, but because a small cut on your hand could kill you. Hygiene in the Wild West was harsh, inconsistent, and often alarming by modern standards. Frontier towns were built quickly. Infrastructure lagged behind population growth. Waste disposal systems were primitive or non-existent. Animals roamed streets. Livestock mixed with human activity. Manure accumulated. Rain turned dirt roads into thick mud layered with biological waste. This wasn't cinematic dust. This was contamination. Clean water was not guaranteed. Wells could become polluted. Rivers were shared by humans and animals alike. During outbreaks of diseases like cholera, a contaminated water source could devastate a community. And remember, germ theory was still developing during much of the 19th century. Many people did not fully understand how bacteria spread. That meant infections were common. A splinter could turn septic. A kitchen knife accident could become fatal. A broken bone could mean permanent disability, or worse. Doctors existed, but medical training varied widely. Some physicians were well educated, others had minimal formal training. Licensing standards were inconsistent. Medical schools differed in quality. And surgery. It was brutal. Anesthesia was available in some cases, but antiseptic practices were inconsistent. Sterilization procedures were not standardized. Surgical instruments were reused. Infection rates were high. Amputations were common responses to severe injuries, especially after industrial or ranch accidents. Imagine breaking your leg miles from town! No ambulance, no emergency room, just a wagon ride over rough terrain, hoping the bone doesn't pierce skin, hoping infection doesn't set in. Pain was not cinematic. It was constant. Dental care was another silent nightmare. Toothbrushes were rare. Toothpaste as we know it did not exist. Dental infections could spread into the bloodstream. A toothache could escalate into a life-threatening condition. Childbirth was especially dangerous. Women on the frontier faced enormous risks during pregnancy and delivery. Complications that are treatable today were often fatal. Infant mortality rates were high. Mothers sometimes did not survive labor. And yet, Hollywood rarely shows this reality. Instead, we see clean costumes, styled hair, and dramatic showdowns under golden sunsets. The real West smelled different. It felt different. It was physically uncomfortable. Bathing was infrequent, particularly during long cattle drives. Cowboys could spend weeks without proper washing. Clothing was worn repeatedly. Water was precious and prioritized for drinking and livestock. Frontier towns did have bathhouses in some places, but regular hygiene was a luxury, not a daily norm for many working-class individuals. Now combine poor sanitation with crowded boomtown conditions. When gold or silver was discovered, thousands flooded into small areas rapidly. Tents, makeshift housing, overcrowding, perfect conditions for disease transmission. Tuberculosis spread. Smallpox spread, influenza spread, and medical resources were limited. But beyond disease, there was psychological strain. Isolation, distance, uncertainty. The West was vast, and that vastness could be terrifying. Imagine living miles away from neighbors, no immediate help if something goes wrong, no instant communication. If someone left town and didn't return, news traveled slowly, rumors filled gaps. Anxiety linked. This wasn't a constant action movie. It was a test of endurance. Now let's talk about another uncomfortable truth. Many outlaws were not born villains in a cinematic sense. Some were shaped by post-war instability. After the Civil War, thousands of men returned home to economic uncertainty. Infrastructure was damaged. Economies were rebuilding. Opportunities were limited. Some men adapted. Some struggled. A few turned to crime. Newspapers, eager for circulation, exaggerated their exploits. A small-time robbery could be reframed as a daring outlaw saga. A local criminal could become nationally known through dramatic reporting. Headlines mattered. Notorious bandit strikes again sells better than minor theft reported. Exaggeration wasn't just entertainment, it was business, and the public consumed it eagerly. Dime novels, cheap, sensational books further amplified the legend. They dramatized frontier life, transforming flawed, complicated individuals into larger-than-life characters. To me, it wasn't created overnight. It evolved, layer by layer, story by story. And when early filmmakers began telling Western stories, they inherited an already exaggerated narrative. Cinema didn't invent the myth. It polished it. It stylized Italiano. It slowed down the gunfights. It gave them rhythm. But in reality, violence was fast. Disease was slow. Exhaustion was constant. And survival required discipline more than bravado. Let's pause for a second and reflect. When you picture the Wild West, do you imagine dramatic duels? Or do you imagine contaminated wells, untreated infections, and families praying through the night during a fever outbreak. That contrast is the dark truth. The real danger of the frontier was not always another gunman. It was vulnerability to illness, to isolation, to economic collapse, to environmental unpredictability. The West was not just a battlefield. It was a fragile ecosystem of ambition and risk. And we're still not done, because next we're going to dismantle one of the biggest myths of all, the idea that everyone openly carried weapons everywhere, all the time. And what that reveals about frontier society may completely change how you see the American West. If this deep dive is reshaping your perspective, take a moment to like the video. It tells the algorithm this kind of history matters. And comment below, what surprises you more, the medical dangers or the exaggeration by newspapers? Stay with me, because the legend is unraveling piece by piece. One of the most powerful and persistent images ever created about the Wild West is simple. A lone man walks down the center of a dusty street. A revolver rests low on his hip. Another man steps out from the saloon. Hands hover near holsters. The entire town watches in silence. This image has shaped global imagination for over a century. But here's the uncomfortable historical reality. In many frontier towns, that armed walk down Main Street would have been illegal. Yes, illegal. Contrary to cinematic mythology reinforced by films like The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, towns enforced firearm restrictions. Visitors were frequently required to surrender their weapons upon entering town. Some communities posted signs clearly warning newcomers to check their guns. Why would a wild town regulate weapons? Because towns were not trying to stay wild. They were trying to survive economically. Let's break this down logically. Frontier towns were fragile ecosystems. Many were built around a single economic opportunity: a mine, a rail stop, a cattle hub, a trading route. Their survival depended on attracting settlers, investors, merchants, and families. Reputation mattered. If word spread that your town was dangerous, unstable, or violent, commerce would decline. Investors would hesitate. Families would choose a different settlement. Railroad companies might route tracks elsewhere. Violence was not a selling point. Stability was, so town councils implemented ordinances, weapon restrictions inside populated areas, curfews, fines for public disorder, regulation of gambling and alcohol, business licensing, property registration. These were not signs of lawlessness, they were signs of institutional development. And that development disrupts the Hollywood narrative. The frontier was not an endless battlefield. It was a transitional society, balancing expansion with order. Rural areas were indeed unpredictable. Wildlife, isolation, banditry, territorial conflict. Carrying a weapon outside town limits often made practical sense. But once inside a concentrated settlement, the rules changed, because concentrated populations increase risk. A stray bullet in open prairie is tragedy. A stray bullet in a crowded street is catastrophe. Now let's dismantle another cinematic staple: the frequency of organized duels. Hollywood shows duels as almost ritualistic. Two opponents stand apart, mutual consent, fair distance. A test of speed and courage. Reality was rarely that structured. Most real shootings were spontaneous. Close range. Often chaotic, frequently influenced by alcohol, sometimes involving multiple shooters. There was no dramatic pause where wind conveniently rolled dust between two adversaries. There was confusion, smoke, noise, fear. The famous shootout at the OK Corral lasted approximately 30 seconds. 30 seconds that would later be stretched into multi-minute dramatic recreations. Why does that matter? Because it reveals how narrative transforms memory. A half-minute exchange became symbolic of an entire era. But what happened on the thousands of ordinary days before and after that event? Merchants opened shops. Children attended lessons. Symbols are powerful, and symbols often outlive facts. Now consider the broader institutional structure forming in the West. Courts were established. Judges held hearings, juries deliberated. Land deeds were recorded, marriage licenses were issued, taxes were collected, elections were organized. These are not the mechanics of anarchy. These are the mechanics of state formation. Frontier towns were not static outposts of chaos. They were evolving municipalities, attempting to integrate into a growing national system. Railroads required coordination and contracts. Mining operations required investment agreements. Ranching required property claims and water rights documentation. Disputes were often settled in courtrooms before they ever reached gunfire. But paperwork is not cinematic. A tense legal hearing doesn't sell tickets like a showdown at sunset. So what gets remembered? The gunshot, not the document. Now let's explore something even deeper. Reputation warfare between towns. Frontier settlements competed with each other. If one town gained notoriety for violence, rival communities could use that narrative strategically, portraying themselves as safer, more stable alternatives. Newspapers played a crucial role here. Editors understood that sensational stories sold copies. A minor altercation could be reframed as a dramatic confrontation. A local thief could become a notorious outlaw. The language used in headlines amplified fear and excitement. Narrative inflation wasn't accidental. It was commercial. And once those stories spread eastward, they fed the imagination of audiences who had never seen the frontier firsthand. The distance between experience and storytelling allowed exaggeration to thrive. Dime novels capitalized on this appetite. Cheap, widely distributed fiction transformed complex individuals into archetypes. The noble sheriff, the cold-blooded outlaw, the mysterious drifter. These simplified roles were easier to consume than layered economic and political realities. When cinema emerged, it inherited this exaggerated mythology. Filmmakers needed dramatic landscapes and moral tension. The West offered both: wide-open spaces, clear conflicts, iconic costumes. But the film industry didn't invent the myth. It refined it, polished it, standardized it. And exported it globally. Which brings us to a critical question. If the West had truly been non-stop violence, how could large-scale infrastructure projects have succeeded? Railroad expansion required thousands of coordinated workers. Supply chains had to function. Financial investors had to trust stability. Telegraph lines had to remain operational. Schools had to open. Churches had to gather congregations. None of this thrives in daily chaos. Economic expansion requires predictability. And predictability requires rules. So the existence of firearm regulations inside towns is not a small historical detail. It is evidence that frontier communities prioritized order over spectacle. They understood something fundamental. Uncontrolled violence destroys growth. Controlled order enables it. This tension between independence and regulation defined the real West. It was not simply a land of rebels and rogues, it was a laboratory for governance under pressure. And perhaps that's why the myth endured. Because it simplifies something that was incredibly complex. It transforms gradual institutional development into heroic confrontation. It replaces bureaucratic struggle with personal duels. It turns economic migration into moral drama. But complexity is more powerful than myth, because complexity reveals humanity. The real West was not a perpetual showdown. It was a negotiation. Between risk and security. Between freedom and responsibility. Between ambition and survival. And once you see that negotiation, the cinematic version feels almost theatrical by comparison. But we're not done. Because in the next section, we'll uncover how this myth didn't just accidentally survive, it was actively manufactured, packaged, marketed, and exported to shape American identity itself. If you've made it this far, you're not just watching, you're dismantling a cultural legend. So take a moment to like the video. It signals that thoughtful history matters. And comment below. If towns regulated guns and built courts, why do you think the myth of constant chaos became so dominant? Stay with me. because the final chapters reveal how the Wild West became one of the most powerful stories ever told, and why that story still shapes perception today. The myth machine. How the Wild West was manufactured. The Wild West wasn't just misunderstood. It was engineered, not by accident, not by coincidence, but by design. Because after the frontier began to close in the late 19th century, something unexpected happened. America needed a legend, and the West was perfect for it. Think about the timing. By the 1890s, the era of open frontier expansion was ending. Railroads connected coast to coast. Territories were becoming states. Large-scale cattle drives were declining. Barbed wire fenced the plains. Industrial cities were rising in the east. The wilderness was shrinking, and with it, the idea of limitless opportunity. So what do nations do when a defining chapter begins to close? They mythologize it. They turn it into identity. And that's exactly what happened with the Wild West. But this transformation didn't begin in Hollywood. It began with performance. It began with spectacle. It began with men like Buffalo Bill. Buffalo Bill wasn't just a former scout. He was a marketing genius. In 1883, he launched Buffalo Bill S.A. Wild West So, a traveling production that toured the United States and later Europe. It featured staged gunfights, reenactments of frontier battles, dramatic horseback riding, and exaggerated portrayals of cowboys, Native Americans, and outlaws. Audiences loved it. Why? Because it offered something industrial America no longer had: adventure, danger, romanticized struggle. In a time of factories, smokestacks, and urban crowding, the Wild West show gave people a story about freedom on horseback. And here's the crucial detail. Many performers in these shows had actually lived in the West. But their stories were rewritten, simplified, amplified, structured into spectacle. Reality became choreography, and choreography became history. When European audiences saw these shows in London or Paris, they didn't see a nuanced portrayal of frontier economics. They saw heroic cowboys, savage battles, clear villains, clear heroes. The myth was exported internationally before film even existed. Now, let's layer in another powerful force: print media. Newspapers in the late 19th century were highly competitive. Sensationalism increased circulation. A robbery could become the reign of terror. A cattle dispute could become war on the plains. Editors understood psychology. Fear sells. Drama sells. Conflict sells. Measured legal proceedings do not. At the same time, dime novels exploded in popularity. These inexpensive booklets told fictionalized stories of gunslingers and lawmen. They reached young readers across America. For many, these stories were their only exposure to the frontier, and fiction blended seamlessly with fact. A moderately known outlaw could become legendary through repeated storytelling. Names grew larger than deeds. Take Jesse James. Yes, he committed crimes. Yes, he robbed banks and trains. But newspapers and dime novels elevated him into a near-mythic anti-hero. Stories emphasized daring escapes, personal charisma, dramatic shootouts. They rarely focused on victims. They rarely highlighted the economic motivations behind his crimes. Myth thrives on selective framing. Now fast forward to the early 20th century. Film arrives, and the Western genre becomes one of the first dominant cinematic forms. Why? Because it was visually simple and emotionally clear. Wide landscapes, high contrast, morality, iconic. Sea-loathed, early silent films built archetypes. Later, full-length westerns refined them. Then came actors who didn't just play cowboys. They embodied the myth, like John Wayne. John Wayne's characters were stoic, principled, morally anchored. He represented rugged individualism in its purest cinematic form. He wasn't just an actor. He became symbolic of American masculinity, and the timing, again, matters. During the Great Depression and World War II, America faced uncertainty and global conflict. The Western offered reassurance. One strong individual could restore order. The cowboy became a metaphor, a symbol of a figure who stood alone against chaos. And then in 1966, a new wave of westerns reshaped the myth again. The good, the bad, and the ugly presented morally ambiguous characters. Violence became more stylized. The West became grittier, dustier, more cynical. Yet Eventyr's revisionist version was still myth. Stylized, curated, designed for emotional impact. Later films like Tombstone reintroduced legendary lawless as near-superhuman figures delivering poetic justice. The cycle repeated: reality, exaggeration, spectacle, cultural identity. But here's the deeper layer. The myth of the Wild West served political purposes too. In the early 20th century, as America expanded its global influence, the cowboy became a national archetype. He represented independence, strength, and moral clarity. The frontier became proof of American The idea was simple: if the nation could tame the wilderness, it could overcome anything. The myth justified expansion. It justified resilience. It reinforced a narrative of destiny. But myths also erase complexity. They minimize the experiences of native tribes. They downplay the role of immigrants. They overlook corporate influence in land acquisition. They simplify violent conflicts into personal rivalries. The West was not built by lone gunmen. It was built by railroad companies, land speculators, laborers, settlers, merchants, politicians, and families. But corporations aren't cinematic. Boardroom negotiations don't inspire epic scores. So the camera stayed focused on the revolver, and the revolver became shorthand for the era. Now, here's where this becomes even more fascinating. The myth didn't just influence entertainment. It influenced behavior. People began performing the myth. Some individuals adopted exaggerated personas because they knew newspapers would amplify them. Reputation became currency. Being feared could be advantageous. Being legendary could provide protection. The line between authentic identity and theatrical identity blurred. T. West wasn't just mythologized after it ended. It was mythologized while it was happening. That feedback loop between reality and storytelling shaped perception in real time. And once a myth hardens into national memory, it becomes incredibly resilient. Even modern video games, television series, and novels continue reinforcing the same core image. Dusty street, lone hero, quick draw, moral showdown. The simplicity is addictive because clarity is comforting. In reality, frontier life was filled with ambiguity, economic uncertainty, legal disputes, social negotiation, cultural tension. But ambiguity doesn't satisfy like a duel at sunset, so we choose the duel. And here's the critical insight. The Wild West myth survived not because it was accurate. It survived because it was useful. It gave America a founding legend separate from European history. It offered a narrative it reinforced the belief that identity could be forged through courage, even if that courage was less about gunfights and more about endurance. The myth became a mirror. People saw in it what they wanted: freedom, strength, independence, adventure. But behind that mirror was something quieter: hard labor, legal paperwork, disease, economic risk, community building, compromise. And that reality may not be as glamorous, but it's far more powerful, because it shows that civilization isn't built by dramatic duels. It's built by persistence. And here's the twist that most people never consider. The real Wild West might actually be more impressive than the myth, because creating stable communities in unpredictable environments requires more courage than pulling a trigger. Negotiating peace requires more strength than firing a shot. Building institutions requires more vision than winning a duel. And that truth changes everything. If you've made it this far, you're not just watching a video. You're watching the dismantling of one of the most successful cultural myths ever constructed. So here's my question for you. Do you think the myth of the Wild West was harmless entertainment, or a powerful narrative that shaped how an entire nation sees itself? Comment below. I read every response, and if this deep dive is changing the way you see history, hit like and subscribe, because in the final part, we're going to confront the ultimate question. Why do we still need the Wild West myth today? And what happens if we finally let it go? The final chapter isn't just about history. It's about identity, and it might challenge everything you thought you knew. Why the Wild West myth still controls how we see the world by the time the American frontier was officially declared closed in 1890 by the U.S. Census Bureau. The Wild West as a geographic reality had already begun transforming into something far more powerful. A national narrative, what had been a complex, unstable, transitional region of economic expansion and territorial conflict, was slowly repackaged into a foundational myth about identity, strength, and destiny. The question is not whether the myth was accurate. The question is why it became necessary. The United States at the end of the 19th century was undergoing massive structural change. Industrialization was accelerating rapidly. Immigration was reshaping cities. Corporate power was expanding. Wealth inequality was rising. Urban labor unrest was growing. The country that had once imagined itself as rural and agrarian was becoming industrial and corporate. In that environment, the Wild West became a symbolic counterweight. It represented a time when problems seemed solvable by individuals rather than institutions. It suggested that courage and grit mattered more than bureaucracy and capital. It offered a narrative where moral clarity replaced systemic complexity. That symbolic power explains why the myth survived long after the material conditions that created it had disappeared. But there is another, deeper layer. The Wild West myth became intertwined with the idea of American exceptionalism, the belief that the United States developed differently, uniquely, and more heroically than other nations. The frontier experience was framed as proof that the country's character had been forged in adversity. The cowboy became a shorthand for independence. The lawman became a shorthand for moral order imposed through strength. This is precisely why Western films became dominant in early American cinema. They did not simply entertain. They encoded values. Consider how films such as The Good, The Bad, and The Ugly or Tombstone structure their conflicts. The central tension is personal. Even when broader political or military contexts exist, resolution comes through individual confrontation. Justice is delivered, faced. Order is restored by a decisive act. This framing shapes perception. It reinforces the idea that complex societal problems can be reduced to personal battles between clearly defined forces of good and evil. The historical frontier rarely operated that way. Land disputes involved overlapping claims, unclear surveys, federal policy ambiguities, railroad interests, and local politics. Cattle conflicts were frequently economic rather than moral. Violence, when it occurred, was often the result of escalation, intoxication, fear, or miscalculation, not cinematic ritual. Yet the cinematic framing proved far more durable than the documentary record. The role of figures like Buffalo Bill in shaping this perception cannot be overstated. His touring Wild West performances in the late 19th century created a live-action template for how the frontier would be remembered. These shows condensed years of conflict into choreographed sequences. They provided audiences with heroes and antagonists. They reduced geopolitics to spectacle. Later, actors such as John Wayne reinforced and standardized that archetype. Wayne's screen persona embodied stoicism, moral certainty, and physical courage. He was not portraying a statistically typical frontiersman. He was portraying an idealized national character. That ideal became aspirational, and aspiration is more powerful than documentation. However, to fully understand why the myth persists, we must examine something more uncomfortable. The myth simplifies morally ambiguous history into digestible narratives. Westward expansion involved displacement of native nations, contested treaties, military campaigns, broken agreements, and forced relocation. These realities complicate heroic storytelling. A myth centered on lone gunfighters is easier to consume than one centered on policy failures and systemic injustice. Myths function as filters. They remove friction, but they also remove responsibility. When structural issues are reframed as personal rivalries, broader systems escape scrutiny. The Wild West myth, by focusing attention on duels and outlaws, diverted attention from the economic engines, driving expansion, railroad corporations, land speculation, federal subsidies, mineral extraction enterprises, and banking interests. The frontier was not merely a cultural phenomenon. It was an economic project. Railroads received enormous land grants. Mining operations required capital investment. Cattle empires depended on supply chains and credit networks. These structures demanded coordination, legal frameworks, and government involvement. That is not the stuff of Hydra cinema, so it faded from popular memory. Yet even now, the myth exerts influence beyond entertainment. Political rhetoric continues to invoke frontier imagery. Rugged individualism, self-made success, suspicion of centralized authority. Corporate branding frequently uses Western aesthetics to signal authenticity or toughness. Even technology entrepreneurs are sometimes framed as digital cowboys taming new frontiers. The metaphor has migrated. The physical frontier is gone. The psychological frontier remains. And that psychological frontier fulfills a modern need. In a world defined by interconnected systems, global supply chains, digital infrastructure, multinational governance, individuals often feel small within large institutions. The cowboy myth restores a sense of agency. It suggests that decisive personal action still matters. But here is the critical distinction. Agency in the real West depended heavily on cooperation. Frontier towns survived through collective effort. Fire brigades were communal. Agricultural irrigation required coordination. Schools were funded locally. Courts were established through shared agreements. Weapon restrictions within town limits existed precisely because communities understood that unregulated violence threatened economic survival. The image of the isolated rider is powerful, but historically misleading. The reality was networks of dependence. If we strip away the myth and examine the historical record carefully, the most impressive achievement of the American West was not dramatic violence. It was institutional formation under unstable conditions. Communities created governance structures in environments with limited infrastructure. They established legal norms before stable enforcement mechanisms existed. They negotiated social contracts in regions where federal presence was distant. That process required patience, compromise, and persistence, qualities far less cinematic than a showdown. So why does the myth continue to overshadow the institutional story? Because myths provide narrative compression. They take sprawling historical processes and condense them into moments. A 30-year economic transformation becomes a 30-second duel. A regional power struggle becomes a personal vendetta. Narrative compression increases emotional impact, but it decreases analytical clarity. If we return to the central claim of this entire series, that the Wild West was not what Hollywood portrayed, the deeper conclusion emerges. The myth was never meant to be accurate. It was meant to be instructive. It teaches self-reliance. It celebrates courage. It dramatizes justice. These are not inherently negative values. The problem arises when myth replaces understanding rather than complementing it. Because when we believe the past was simpler than it was, we risk demanding simplistic solutions to modern problems. The Wild West myth suggests that disorder can be solved through decisive confrontation. The historical record suggests that durable order emerges from systems, institutions, and negotiated norms. That distinction matters profoundly today. We live in an era saturated with information amplification. Headlines exaggerate. Social media compresses nuance. Complex policy debates are framed as binary conflicts. Inmaniguals. Uno de liga. Modern information ecosystems operate similarly to the sensationalist newspapers of the 19th century that inflated frontier stories. The lesson is not merely about the past. It is about how narratives form in real time. The Wild West myth demonstrates how repetition creates memory. When stories are told frequently enough, with enough emotional charge, they solidify into assumed truth. Generations raised on Western films internalized a stylized frontier long before reading a historical account. That same mechanism operates now. Understanding how the Wild West was mythologized provides a template for analyzing how contemporary myths emerge. And perhaps that is the ultimate reason this topic matters. The frontier is a case study in narrative construction. It reveals how entertainment, journalism, politics, and economics intersect to shape collective memory. It shows how symbols outlive facts, and it demonstrates that the most powerful stories are rarely the most precise ones. So what happens if we consciously separate myth from history? We do not lose the aesthetic, the Western genre, can still be appreciated as art. The imagery can still inspire. The archetypes can still resonate. But we gained something more substantial. We gain the ability to admire the past without misunderstanding it. We gain respect for the complexity of frontier communities who prioritized order over chaos. We recognize that most towns prohibited carrying firearms within municipal limits. We understand that gunfights were rare compared to daily labor. We acknowledge that cowboys spent far more time herding cattle than engaging in duels. We confront the reality that hygiene was poor, medical knowledge limited, and survival uncertain. And in doing so, we arrive at a more mature relationship with history. The Wild West was not a constant battlefield. It was a developmental phase. It was messy, uneven, often harsh, but fundamentally oriented toward building stability. That is not a weaker story. It is a stronger one, because it suggests that progress emerges not from spectacle, but from structure, not from isolation, but from cooperation, not from mythology, but from persistence. If you've stayed with this entire series, you've done more than revisit a historical period. You've examined how legends are constructed, why they endure, and what they conceal. Now, I want to hear from you. Do you think societies need myths like the Wild West to maintain identity and cohesion? Or do you believe confronting historical complexity makes a culture stronger? Leave your answer in the comments. I read them carefully. If this deep dive changed your perception, press like so more people can see that history is more nuanced than cinema suggests. Subscribe if you want future explorations that separate legend from record. Because the Wild West is not just about cowboys and gunfights, it is about how stories shape nations. And the stories we choose to believe today will define how we are remembered tomorrow.